The courtroom was silent, the tension so thick it felt as though the air itself had been frozen in time. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Superior Court of California, its golden rays bouncing off the polished wooden benches and illuminating the faces of those who had gathered for what was being dubbed the divorce of the decade. Andrew Voss, the billionaire soccer player who had once been the darling of the tabloids, sat cool and composed at the defendant's table. His sharp navy suit was impeccably tailored, and his expression was unreadable, almost detached. Beside him, his mother Margaret sat with an air of quiet authority, her presence as imposing as ever. On the opposite side of the courtroom, Jenny Carter exuded anything but composure. Her usually flawless appearance was marred by the faint traces of sleepless nights. Her eyes, wide with indignation and disbelief, flickered toward Andrew with a mix of fury and desperation. Dressed in an elegant white sheath dress, she looked every bit the glamorous socialite, but there was a distinct crack in her polished exterior. The proceedings had been standard fare until this moment. Jenny's attorney had argued passionately for a sizable settlement, citing the luxurious lifestyle Jenny had grown accustomed to during her 3 years of marriage to Andrew. The evidence of their shared life was on full display: exotic vacations, couture wardrobes, and sprawling properties in some of the world's most exclusive locations. Jenny, the plaintiff, had confidently demanded what she believed was her due, half of Andrew's fortune. Then Andrew had spoken. "My assets," he said, his voice calm yet commanding, "are not mine to give." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow, her gavel hovering as if ready to restore order at any moment. The reporters seated in the back row scrambled to capture his words, their fingers flying across keyboards. Jenny froze, her attorney visibly flustered. "Excuse me," the lawyer stammered, leaning forward. "Could you clarify, Mr. Voss?" Andrew's gaze remained steady, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, resolve, perhaps, or a subtle satisfaction. He leaned into the microphone, his voice slicing through the stunned silence like a blade. "Everything I own is under my mother's name," he said, enunciating each word with deliberate clarity. "Legally, I have no assets." The room erupted. Spectators whispered frantically to one another, while the judge banged her gavel for order. Jenny's face turned an ashen shade, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for a response that refused to come. She looked at Andrew, her wide eyes pleading for answers, but his expression remained stoic. Margaret, seated beside her son, allowed the faintest of smiles to curve her lips. She leaned back in her chair, her hands clasped tightly, the image of control. Jenny, on the other hand, gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table so hard her knuckles turned white. "This is absurd." Jenny's lawyer finally managed, his voice rising. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a tactic to deprive my client of her rightful settlement." "It is the truth," Andrew replied evenly. "Every property, every investment, every penny tied to my name legally belongs to Margaret Voss. I own nothing." The words hung in the air, final and unshakable. The once confident Jenny now seemed fragile, her carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of the revelation. For the first time in her life, the woman who had always seemed to have the upper hand realized she was playing a game she could not win. And as the courtroom buzzed with speculation and disbelief, Andrew sat back, calm as ever, a man who had just shattered the foundation of an entire narrative with a single, calculated move. Before the courtroom drama and shattered illusions, there was another story, a story of passion, luxury, and the kind of love that burned bright enough to captivate the world. It was June 25, 2019, a warm summer evening in Monte Carlo, where the world's elite gathered to celebrate their wealth and status at an exclusive yacht party. The harbor glittered with the lights of luxury vessels, their towering masts casting shadows over the pristine marina. Waiters in crisp white uniforms weaved effortlessly through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres. The scent of saltwater mixed with expensive perfumes as laughter and the low hum of conversation filled the air. Amid this glittering spectacle, Andrew Voss stood at the edge of the deck, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the golden hues of the setting sun. His tailored white linen shirt was open at the collar, exuding effortless charm. A household name in soccer, Andrew was no stranger to adoration. Yet, in this moment, he seemed detached, swirling a glass of whiskey as though he were waiting for something, or someone. That someone arrived in the form of Jenny Carter. The moment she stepped aboard the yacht, heads turned. Her flowing emerald green dress, designed to hug her figure perfectly, seemed to shimmer with every movement. With her golden hair swept into soft waves and a dazzling smile that could disarm the most hardened cynic, she exuded a magnetic energy that commanded attention. Andrew noticed her immediately. For a moment, he forgot the conversations swirling around him. It was not just her beauty that captivated him, it was the way she carried herself, confident and unapologetically bold. Jenny's eyes scanned the crowd, sharp and calculating, until they landed on him. She smiled, and just like that, the distance between them disappeared. "You are Andrew Voss," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Her voice was smooth, with just the right mix of curiosity and flirtation. The man every headline cannot seem to get enough of. Andrew chuckled, his usual guarded demeanor giving way to genuine amusement. "And you are?" "Jenny Carter," she said simply, extending her hand. "Though you will not find my name in any headlines, yet." From that first exchange, the chemistry was undeniable. They talked about everything and nothing, their banter light but charged with electricity. Jenny spoke of her travels and her love of the arts, while Andrew shared glimpses of his life beyond the field. For the first time in a long while, Andrew felt like someone saw him as more than a soccer star. Jenny had a way of drawing him in, making him feel as though he were the only man in the world. The night unfolded like a dream. They danced under the stars, the gentle sway of the yacht matching the rhythm of their movements. When the party ended, they lingered, watching the moonlight dance on the water. Andrew found himself captivated not just by Jenny's beauty, but by her ambition, her wit, and the way she seemed to challenge him without fear. By the time the sun rose, Andrew was no longer just the man who had conquered soccer, he was a man falling, perhaps too quickly, for the enigmatic woman who had entered his life with the force of a storm. It was the beginning of something extraordinary, or so it seemed. What Andrew did not know, as he leaned in to kiss Jenny beneath the fading stars, was that this night would mark the first chapter of a story far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. 6 months after their whirlwind meeting in Monte Carlo, Andrew's life had transformed into a parade of glamour, love, and public adoration. His relationship with Jenny was the envy of millions, splashed across every tabloid and gossip blog. Yet, beneath the surface of their fairy tale romance, a quiet storm was brewing, one that only Margaret Voss could see. It was a crisp December morning in Beverly Hills, and the Voss family estate was as immaculate as ever. The sprawling mansion, perched atop a hill overlooking the city, was a testament to Margaret's meticulous eye for perfection. Every marble column, every glinting chandelier, spoke of control and order, the very qualities Margaret had built her life around. Andrew arrived at the estate that morning, excited to share the news. The polished black sports car glided into the circular driveway, its engine purring to a stop. Stepping out in a casual sweater and slacks, Andrew looked every bit the relaxed son coming to visit his mother. But inside his pocket was a velvet box containing a diamond ring, a ring he intended to place on Jenny's finger. Margaret greeted her son in the grand sitting room, where the winter sunlight streamed through towering glass windows. She rose from her chair, her tailored gray suit emphasizing her commanding presence. A woman in her late 60s, Margaret had aged gracefully, her silver-streaked hair swept into a tight chignon and her piercing blue eyes scanning Andrew with the precision of a hawk. "Andrew," she said warmly, embracing him briefly before stepping back to inspect him as though he were still the boy she had raised. "You look well. And you look as sharp as ever, Mom," Andrew replied with a grin, sinking into a leather armchair across from her. The conversation began light, covering family updates and the latest on Andrew's soccer career. But Margaret, ever the strategist, sensed there was more on his mind. She let him talk, waiting patiently until he finally reached into his pocket and retrieved the small velvet box. "I'm proposing to Jenny," Andrew announced, his smile widening as he opened the box to reveal the dazzling diamond ring. "Tonight." For a moment, Margaret said nothing. Her sharp eyes flicked from the ring to her son's face, and then she leaned back, her hands clasped in her lap. The silence stretched, filling the room with an unmistakable tension. "Andrew," she began, her tone measured, "are you certain this is the right decision?" His smile faltered. "Of course I'm certain. I love her, Mom. She's everything I've ever wanted." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Jenny is charming, yes. Beautiful, certainly. But have you considered what it is she wants? Or, more precisely, why she wants you?" Andrew's expression hardened. "You're judging her without even knowing her." "I know enough," Margaret replied firmly. "I've seen women like her before, drawn to the spotlight, the wealth, the lifestyle. You are not the first young man to fall for such charms, and you will not be the last." "That's not fair," Andrew shot back, his voice rising slightly. "Jenny loves me for who I am, not for what I have." Margaret tilted her head, her gaze softening but her words no less pointed. "Andrew, I do not say this to hurt you. I say it because I love you. If you're certain about her, then I will support you. But I would advise you to take precautions. Protect yourself." Andrew stood abruptly, slipping the ring box back into his pocket. "I don't need protecting, Mom. I need you to trust me." Margaret sighed, watching him walk toward the door. "I trust you, Andrew," she called after him. "But love is blind, and you are walking into this with your eyes closed." The words stayed with Andrew as he drove back to his penthouse, though he dismissed them as unnecessary caution. Margaret, meanwhile, remained in the sitting room, gazing out over the city below. She had seen the cracks in Jenny's perfect facade, and though she wished her instincts were wrong, she could not ignore the unease growing in her chest. Margaret had spent her life protecting Andrew, from bad decisions, opportunistic friends, and the pitfalls of fame. And now, as she stared into the distance, she silently resolved to do whatever it took to safeguard her son, even if it meant interfering in ways he would never forgive. The months following Andrew's proposal to Jenny were a whirlwind of extravagance and public adoration. Their engagement became the hottest topic in global media, a perfect union of sports royalty and socialite glamour. For Jenny, it was everything she had ever dreamed of, and more. The couple moved into Andrew's penthouse in Dubai, a marvel of modern luxury perched atop one of the city's most exclusive towers. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided breathtaking views of the glittering skyline, and the sleek interiors were adorned with custom-designed furniture and priceless art. Every corner of their home screamed wealth and sophistication, a world far removed from the ordinary. Jenny thrived in this environment. She hosted lavish parties that attracted the crème de la crème of society, celebrities, tycoons, and influencers all clamored for an invitation to the events she curated. Her Instagram feed became a gallery of opulence, each post meticulously crafted to showcase her life as Mrs. Vos-to-be. From sipping champagne on private yachts to wearing gowns that cost more than some people's yearly salaries, Jenny reveled in the spotlight. Andrew, however, began to feel the weight of their high-profile life. He had always enjoyed success and recognition on the soccer field, but the relentless attention off the pitch was different. The parties Jenny threw often left him exhausted, and he found himself retreating to the quieter corners of their penthouse, longing for the simplicity of his earlier years. One evening, as Jenny prepared for yet another event, Andrew sat in the corner of their spacious living room, nursing a glass of wine. She was in her dressing room, surrounded by an array of designer dresses, deciding which one would make the biggest impression. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from event planners and celebrity friends. "You're not dressed yet," she called out, her voice light but tinged with impatience. Andrew glanced at his watch. Do I have to come to this one, Jenny? I've had a long week, and I'm exhausted. Jenny appeared in the doorway, her hands on her hips, a sparkling silver gown draped over her arm. Her expression shifted, irritation flickering across her face. Of course, you have to come. People expect to see you there, Andrew. We're a team, remember? Andrew sighed, running a hand through his hair. I just feel like all we ever do is host or attend these events. Do you ever think about taking a step back, just enjoying some quiet time together? Jenny's frustration softened into a smile, though it was more placating than genuine. She walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. I know this is a lot for you. But this is our life now. People look up to us, they want to see the perfect couple. Andrew looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Do they? Or do they just want to see the image we're putting out? Jenny pulled her hand back, her jaw tightening slightly. This is who we are, Andrew. If you can't handle it, she stopped herself, shaking her head and forcing a laugh. Never mind. Just get dressed, okay? Andrew watched her walk back into the dressing room, the tension lingering in the air. He had started to notice moments like these more often, moments when Jenny's priorities seemed more focused on appearances than their relationship. It was subtle, but it was there, gnawing at him like an itch he could not scratch. Later that night, as they stepped out of the elevator into a sea of flashing cameras, Andrew plastered on his best smile. Jenny, radiant in her silver gown, clung to his arm, basking in the attention. For the crowd, they were the epitome of perfection, a dream couple living the ultimate fantasy. But beneath the glitz and glamour, Andrew could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. The parties, the endless socializing, the carefully curated image, it all felt hollow. And as he glanced at Jenny, who was busy posing for the photographers, he wondered if the life they were building together was truly for them, or for everyone else watching. Andrew's unease continued to grow, an undercurrent of tension flowing beneath the surface of his glittering life with Jenny. On the outside, they appeared to be the perfect couple, attending gala events, splashed across magazine covers, and dominating social media. But behind closed doors, the cracks in their relationship were widening. It was Valentine's Day, 2022. Their private villa in Beverly Hills was bathed in soft golden light as the sun dipped below the horizon. Andrew had planned a quiet evening at home, a rare break from their hectic social schedule. The villa's sprawling living room was arranged with candles and a table set for two, overlooking the manicured gardens. He hoped this would be a moment to reconnect, to remind themselves of the love that had brought them together. Jenny arrived late, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she entered. She was dressed impeccably in a scarlet gown, her hair styled to perfection, but her eyes carried the unmistakable look of someone who had been somewhere else entirely, mentally and physically. "You're late," Andrew said, his voice calm but tinged with disappointment. He stood by the table, hands resting on the back of a chair. Jenny barely glanced at him as she set her designer clutch on a nearby table. "I was at the gallery opening. You know how those things go, networking, photos, the usual." She waved her hand dismissively. "I'm here now, though." Andrew took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I thought tonight was about us, Jenny. No cameras, no networking, just us." Jenny arched an eyebrow, finally meeting his gaze. "Andrew, I can't just disappear from these events. People expect me to be there. It's part of who we are." Andrew's frustration began to bubble to the surface. "Who we are? Or who you want us to be? Because I'm starting to feel like I don't even recognize this life anymore." Jenny laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "What are you saying? That you don't like the attention, the success? This is what you signed up for, Andrew." He moved around the table toward her, his voice lowering but no less intense. "What I signed up for was a partnership, Jenny. Not a show. Lately, it feels like all you care about is the next photo op or party invitation. Jenny's eyes narrowed, her irritation clear. You're being dramatic. This is just what comes with being in the public eye. You knew that when you married me. Andrew shook his head, stepping back. No, I didn't know it would be like this. I didn't know that I'd feel more like your accessory than your husband. For a moment, the room fell silent. Jenny's expression shifted, a flicker of guilt passing over her face before she smoothed it away. Andrew, she said softly, moving closer to him. I didn't mean to make you feel that way. It's just, there's a lot of pressure on me too, you know. I'm trying to keep us on top. On top of what? Andrew asked, his voice quieter now. A game I didn't even realize we were playing. Jenny didn't answer. Instead, she leaned forward, pressing a kiss to his cheek. Let's not ruin the evening. I'll change into something more comfortable, and we'll have dinner. Okay. Andrew nodded, but the unease in his chest remained. As Jenny disappeared into the bedroom, he sat down at the table, staring at the flickering candlelight. He wanted to believe her, to trust that her intentions were pure. But the red flags were becoming harder to ignore, the late nights, the endless focus on appearances, the way she always seemed just out of reach. He picked up his glass of wine, swirling it absently. For all the luxury and beauty surrounding him, Andrew felt more alone than he ever had. And in the back of his mind, a question began to form, a question he wasn't ready to answer. Was this what love was supposed to feel like? While Andrew wrestled with doubts about his marriage, Margaret Voss was quietly ensuring that her worst fears would never come to fruition. She had watched her son's life with Jenny from the sidelines, her sharp instincts catching details Andrew seemed blind to, details that confirmed her initial suspicions about Jenny's intentions. For Margaret, there was no room for complacency when it came to her son's future. It was January 20th, 2021, when Margaret put her plan into motion. She sat in the opulent office of Charles Whitman, her longtime financial advisor, who had managed the Voss family fortune for decades. The room, lined with dark wood paneling and shelves of leather-bound books, radiated old-world sophistication. Margaret leaned back in a high-backed leather chair, her presence commanding despite her calm demeanor. Are you certain about this, Margaret? Charles asked, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the stack of documents in front of him. Margaret nodded, her steely blue eyes unwavering. Completely. Transfer all of Andrew's assets into the Voss family trust under my name. Properties, investments, accounts, everything. Charles frowned, leaning forward. This will strip Andrew of legal ownership of his wealth. It will still be accessible to him, of course, but he will not technically own anything. That is precisely the point, Margaret said, her tone clipped. Andrew may not see the danger, but I do. Jenny Carter is a risk, Charles. She is a woman who has perfected the art of charm, and she will not hesitate to exploit my son's vulnerabilities. Charles hesitated. And what if Andrew finds out? He might see this as an overstep. Margaret's expression softened, though her resolve did not waver. He might, she admitted. But he will also thank me one day. My son is an extraordinary man, but he has always led with his heart. It is my job to protect him where he cannot protect himself. With a resigned nod, Charles began signing off on the paperwork. This will take a few weeks to finalize. Everything will appear seamless, as though nothing has changed. However, if Jenny were to file for divorce or attempt to claim any part of Andrew's fortune, she will find herself empty-handed. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. That is all I need. As Charles worked, Margaret glanced out the window at the bustling New York City streets below. She thought of the life she had built for Andrew, the sacrifices she had made to ensure his success. Everything she had done, she reminded herself, was for him. And if it meant being the villain in his eyes for a time, so be it. By the time the financial transfers were complete weeks later, Andrew was none the wiser. Margaret had orchestrated the shift so skillfully that not even his legal team noticed. Andrew continued to live as though nothing had changed, blissfully unaware that his mother now held the keys to his empire. In the months that followed, Margaret observed Jenny's growing influence with a quiet confidence. She watched as Jenny pushed for more control in their shared decisions, first suggesting joint bank accounts, then hinting at the idea of merging their finances entirely. Each time, Andrew deflected, his instincts telling him to delay, though he couldn't fully articulate why. Jenny, meanwhile, began to notice subtle roadblocks. Her requests for access to certain accounts were met with polite refusals, and Andrew seemed less inclined to discuss financial matters with her altogether. Frustrated but determined, she brushed it off as a temporary hurdle, unaware that Margaret's plan had effectively sealed off any avenue for exploitation. For Margaret, it was a quiet triumph. She kept her distance, never revealing the full extent of her actions, but she continued to watch, waiting for the inevitable moment when Jenny's true colors would come to light. And as she sat in her Beverly Hills estate one evening, sipping a glass of Bordeaux and reviewing reports on the family trust, Margaret allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. She had done her duty, and no matter what lay ahead, she knew she was ready. Because if Jenny Carter thought she could outmaneuver Margaret Voss, she was sorely mistaken. It was a crisp summer morning on June 30, 2022, when Jenny Carter walked into the Superior Court of California with all the confidence of someone who believed she had already won. Clad in a tailored white suit, her blonde hair perfectly styled, she exuded the poise of a woman ready to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. The media swarmed outside, eager for a glimpse of the woman taking on one of the wealthiest athletes in the world. Flashing cameras and shouted questions followed Jenny as she ascended the courthouse steps. Her attorney, a sharp-dressed man with a reputation for securing massive settlements in high-profile divorces, walked beside her, his briefcase a silent promise of victory. Inside, Andrew Voss sat in a quiet corner of the courtroom, away from the chaos outside. He had arrived earlier to avoid the cameras, dressed simply in a dark suit with no tie. His demeanor was calm, but those who knew him well would have recognized the tension in his jaw and the way his fingers tapped lightly on the armrest of his chair. He was not surprised by Jenny's decision to file for divorce, it had been brewing for months. What surprised him was the brazenness of her timing and the confidence with which she seemed to approach it. Jenny had made her intentions clear the night before, during a heated argument at their Beverly Hills villa. "I've had enough, Andrew," she had said, pacing the living room like a caged animal. "You're shutting me out of everything, your career, your finances, your life. You don't trust me, and I can't live like this anymore." Andrew, leaning against the edge of the sofa with his arms crossed, had met her outburst with a quiet intensity. "Trust has to be earned, Jenny," he replied. "And lately, all you've shown me is that your priorities lie somewhere else." Jenny's eyes had narrowed. "If you think you can cut me out and leave me with nothing, you're sorely mistaken. I'm your wife, Andrew. And when this is over, half of everything you have will be mine." The memory played in Andrew's mind as he sat in the courtroom, watching Jenny take her place at the plaintiff's table. Her attorney stood, clearing his throat as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Jenny Carter Voss, is here to seek an equitable division of assets accrued during her marriage to Mr. Andrew Voss. Given Mr. Voss's substantial wealth, we believe Mrs. Carter Voss is entitled to 50% of the marital estate." Andrew's attorney, a composed woman in her 50s with a sharp wit and decades of experience, stood in response. "Your Honor, my client disputes the plaintiff's claim. While Mr. Voss has undoubtedly achieved significant financial success during his career, the assets in question are not under his direct ownership and therefore cannot be considered part of the marital estate." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Andrew's attorney turned to the courtroom, her voice steady. "All assets associated with Mr. Voss, properties, investments, accounts, are legally held under the Voss family trust, controlled solely by Margaret Voss. As such, my client does not have the legal authority to distribute or divide these assets." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, followed by a stunned silence. Jenny's confident facade cracked for the briefest moment, her lips parting in disbelief. She turned to her attorney, whispering frantically, but he looked equally blindsided. The judge banged her gavel for order. "Is this accurate, Mr. Voss?" she asked, her gaze sharp. Andrew stood, his voice calm and resolute. "Yes, Your Honor. Every asset associated with my name is under the Voss family trust. I own nothing." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters in the back row whispered furiously into their phones, while spectators exchanged incredulous looks. Jenny sat frozen, her perfectly composed image unraveling as the gravity of Andrew's statement sank in. Andrew returned to his seat, his expression unreadable, but inside, he felt the weight of the moment. He had not wanted things to come to this. Yet, as he glanced briefly at Jenny, he knew this confrontation had been inevitable. Across the courtroom, Margaret sat in silent triumph. She had seen this moment coming long before anyone else had, and her plan had worked flawlessly. But even as she watched Jenny's composure falter, a small voice in the back of her mind wondered whether Andrew would ever forgive her for the lengths she had gone to protect him. And so, as the gavel struck again and the judge called for order, the stage was set for the battle to come, one that would not only test the strength of Andrew's resolve but also reveal the true depths of Jenny's desperation. The Superior Court of California was packed. The media frenzy surrounding Andrew and Jenny's divorce had turned the proceedings into a public spectacle. Reporters lined the back rows, their pens poised, while curious onlookers filled every available seat, eager to witness the drama unfold. Andrew sat calmly at the defendant's table, his attorney flipping through meticulously prepared documents. Beside him, Margaret was the picture of poise, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Though her expression was serene, her sharp eyes scanned the room, assessing every detail like a seasoned general preparing for battle. At the plaintiff's table, Jenny's confidence seemed to have eroded since the shocking revelation about the Voss family trust. She fidgeted with the edge of her designer blazer, her attorney whispering hurried advice in her ear. Though she tried to appear composed, the strain of the moment was evident in her tight smile and darting eyes. The judge entered, a stern woman in her 60s who commanded the room's attention with a single look. "Court is now in session," she declared, settling into her seat. "We will continue with the testimony and evidence presented by both parties." Jenny's attorney was the first to speak. Rising from his seat, he adjusted his tie and approached the bench with a practiced air of authority. "Your Honor, while it has been established that the assets are held in a trust under Mrs. Voss's name, we argue that this arrangement was deliberately constructed to deprive my client of her rightful share. This is not just about legal ownership, it's about intention." He turned, addressing the courtroom with theatrical flair. "The plaintiff, Mrs. Jenny Carter Voss, entered this marriage in good faith, contributing to the lifestyle and public image that Mr. Voss enjoys today. She deserves fair compensation for the sacrifices she made." Andrew's attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Helen Stokes, stood in response. "Your Honor, the argument presented by the plaintiff's counsel is speculative at best. The Voss family trust predates this marriage by decades, and its purpose is to protect family assets across generations. This arrangement was not created to target Mrs. Carter Voss but to safeguard a legacy." The judge nodded, her expression neutral. "Do you have evidence to support your claim, Mr. Abbott?" Jenny's attorney hesitated. "We have documentation showing the financial benefits Mrs. Carter Voss brought to their public image, endorsements, sponsorship deals, increased media attention." Helen raised an eyebrow. "That's speculation, Your Honor, not concrete evidence. Publicity is not a quantifiable marital asset." The judge rapped her gavel lightly. "I will determine what is admissible, Ms. Stokes." Jenny watched the exchange with growing frustration. She felt the walls closing in around her, the case slipping through her fingers. Desperation flickered in her eyes as she leaned toward her attorney and whispered fiercely. "Do something. Find something. At the defendant's table, Andrew remained composed, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his inner turmoil. He glanced toward Jenny, their eyes meeting briefly across the room. For a fleeting moment, he saw something that gave him pause, fear, perhaps, or regret. Jenny's attorney called her to the stand. She rose, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she walked to the witness chair. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted the microphone and folded her hands in her lap. Mrs. Carter-Voss, her attorney began, his tone softening. Can you tell the court how this marriage has affected you personally? Jenny hesitated, her gaze shifting toward Andrew. At first, she began, her voice trembling slightly, our life together was everything I had dreamed of. But over time, Andrew became distant. He shut me out of important decisions, especially when it came to finances. I felt like I was just an accessory in his life. Andrew's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Jenny continued, her voice gaining strength. I loved him. I still do. But love isn't enough when you're treated like you don't belong. Helen Stokes stood, her tone sharp. Mrs. Carter-Voss, are you suggesting that your husband's decision to protect his family's assets is a reflection of his feelings for you? Jenny faltered. I'm saying it made me feel excluded. Unimportant. Helen pressed on. And yet, you continued to enjoy the benefits of the lifestyle these assets provided, didn't you? Jenny's composure wavered, and she shot a quick glance at her attorney. That's not the point, she replied, her voice rising slightly. But it is relevant, Helen countered, her voice steady. You filed for divorce believing you were entitled to a significant portion of these assets. Now that you know they're inaccessible, are you still pursuing this case out of love, or out of anger? The question hung in the air, and for a moment, the courtroom was silent. Jenny's lips parted, but no words came. Her silence spoke volumes. Margaret watched from her seat, her expression carefully neutral, though a flicker of triumph danced in her eyes. Andrew, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Jenny. He wanted to feel anger, but what he felt instead was something far more complicated, pity. As the judge called for a recess, the tension in the room lingered, heavy and unresolved. This was no longer just a legal battle, it was a reckoning, and neither side would emerge unscathed. The courtroom had become a battlefield, and Jenny was beginning to realize that her current strategy was a losing one. The legal maneuvering, the airtight Voss family trust, and Margaret's composed presence in court all made one thing clear: she was outmatched. But Jenny Carter was not the type to back down without a fight. 2 weeks after the explosive courtroom exchange, Jenny sat in a dimly lit office in downtown Los Angeles. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, its walls lined with file cabinets and outdated legal textbooks. Across the desk from her sat Victor Klein, a private investigator with a reputation for digging up dirt where others saw clean surfaces. Victor was a wiry man in his late 40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. He leaned back in his chair, the overhead light glinting off his bald head, and regarded Jenny with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. You want me to dig into Margaret Voss, Victor repeated, his voice tinged with amusement. Not Andrew, not his finances, but his mother. Jenny nodded, her lips set in a firm line. That's right. Margaret is the one pulling the strings. If I want leverage, it starts with her. Victor steepled his fingers, his expression thoughtful. You do realize this woman has been running circles around corporate lawyers and financial regulators for decades, right? If there's dirt, it's buried deep. Then dig deeper, Jenny snapped, leaning forward. I don't care how long it takes or how much it costs. Just find something, anything, that I can use. Victor smirked, pulling a notepad from his desk drawer. You've got grit. I'll give you that. Let's see what we can uncover. Over the next several days, Victor worked tirelessly, diving into Margaret's history with a level of scrutiny that few had dared to attempt. He pored over property records, corporate filings, and financial transactions, piecing together a timeline that spanned decades. Margaret's wealth was formidable, but so was her ability to keep her affairs meticulously clean. For every lead Victor found, there seemed to be a dozen dead ends. But then, late one evening, Victor stumbled upon something unusual. Tucked away in a set of old corporate filings was a reference to a dissolved trust, one that predated the Voss family trust. It was linked to a property in the Hamptons and, more intriguingly, to a name that had not appeared anywhere else in Margaret's records, Sophia King. Victor's interest was piqued. A few more hours of digging revealed that Sophia King was a journalist who had once been romantically linked to Andrew Voss, years before he met Jenny. The connection was faint, almost invisible, but there was enough to suggest that Margaret had interfered in the relationship. Victor pieced together correspondence and financial transactions that hinted at Margaret's involvement in orchestrating Sophia's sudden departure from Andrew's life. When Victor presented his findings to Jenny, her reaction was a mix of vindication and fury. "So Margaret sabotaged Andrew's past relationship," she said, her voice tight. "She manipulated him, just like she's trying to manipulate me." Victor leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "Looks like it. If you can bring this to light, it could shake things up. But be careful, Margaret doesn't strike me as someone who plays fair." Jenny's mind raced. This was exactly the leverage she needed, not just to push back against Margaret but to plant doubt in Andrew's mind. If he learned about his mother's interference, it could fracture the trust between them, and that was the kind of chaos Jenny could use to her advantage. A week later, armed with Victor's findings, Jenny prepared for her next move. As she reviewed the documents, a grim determination settled over her. She was no longer just fighting for money, she was fighting to expose the truth about Margaret and to reclaim the narrative that had spiraled out of her control. In the quiet of her apartment, Jenny allowed herself a small, bitter smile. Margaret Voss might have built an empire of control, but Jenny was about to prove that even empires had their cracks. And once you found those cracks, it was only a matter of time before the walls came tumbling down. Jenny sat in the back of her attorney's car, staring at the file in her lap. It was thick with copies of letters, old financial records, and emails that painted a damning picture of Margaret Voss's calculated interference in Andrew's life. One name stood out above all: Sophia King. Jenny had no personal connection to the woman, but the story hidden within these documents was clear. Sophia was once the love of Andrew's life, and Margaret had ensured their relationship ended abruptly. The car pulled up to the courthouse steps, but Jenny didn't move. Her attorney, Mr. Abbott, glanced back at her. "Jenny, are you ready for this?" Jenny nodded, though her grip on the file tightened. "I'm ready. Let's give Margaret a taste of her own medicine." The courtroom was tense that morning, the buzz of anticipation heightened by the media's relentless coverage of the divorce. Andrew sat at the defendant's table, his face calm but his posture rigid. Margaret was beside him, her ever-composed demeanor giving no hint of concern. She had weathered storms before, and this one would be no different, or so she thought. When the judge called the session to order, Mr. Abbott stood. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to present new evidence regarding the Voss family's conduct and its direct impact on this case." Andrew's attorney, Helen Stokes, immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The plaintiff has had weeks to submit any evidence. Introducing it now is inappropriate." The judge held up her hand. "Let me see the evidence before I decide." She gestured for Abbott to proceed. Jenny watched as Mr. Abbott approached the bench, holding the file as though it were a weapon. He handed it to the judge, who began to skim the contents. Her brow furrowed slightly as she read, and then she looked up. "Explain this," the judge said. Abbott turned to face the courtroom. "This evidence reveals a pattern of manipulation by Margaret Voss, the trustee of the Voss Family Trust. Specifically, it shows her deliberate actions to sabotage a prior relationship of Mr. Voss with a woman named Sophia King. This interference raises questions about Mrs. Voss's control over the trust and her motivations in shielding her son's assets. Andrew frowned, leaning toward Margaret. What is he talking about? Margaret's lips thinned, but she didn't respond. Abbott continued, Your Honor, these letters and financial transactions indicate that Mrs. Voss paid Sophia King a substantial sum to leave the country and end her relationship with Mr. Voss. We also have correspondence showing Mrs. Voss's efforts to frame Sophia as a distraction to Mr. Voss's career, convincing him she was not worthy of his time. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Andrew's face darkened, his calm exterior cracking. Is this true? He asked, his voice low but sharp. Margaret turned to him, her expression finally showing a hint of unease. Andrew, I did what I thought was best for you. Sophia wasn't. You had no right, Andrew interrupted, his voice rising. She was everything to me, and you. He stopped, shaking his head as though trying to process the betrayal. You manipulated me. You made me believe she didn't care. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Jenny watched the exchange with a mix of satisfaction and guilt. This wasn't just about exposing Margaret, it was about showing Andrew the truth, even if it hurt. Margaret straightened, her voice firm. Andrew, I was protecting you. Sophia would have held you back. She wasn't strong enough for the life you were destined to lead. Andrew stared at her, his jaw tight. The life I'm leading now? A marriage that's falling apart, a courtroom full of strangers dissecting my every move. Maybe if you hadn't interfered, things would have been different. The judge rapped her gavel. Order in the court. Abbott seized the moment. Your Honor, this interference reflects a clear pattern of control that undermines the integrity of the Voss family trust. It is relevant to this case because it shows Mrs. Voss's willingness to manipulate others for her own purposes. Helen Stokes stood, her voice cutting through the room. Your Honor, this is an attempt to distract from the fact that the trust is legally sound and unrelated to this marriage. The plaintiff is using emotional manipulation to sway this court. The judge raised her hand again. Enough. I will review the evidence further before ruling on its admissibility. For now, we will adjourn. As the courtroom emptied, Andrew remained seated, staring at the table in front of him. Margaret reached out to touch his arm, but he pulled away. I need time to think, he said, his voice cold. Jenny lingered by the door, watching the scene unfold. She should have felt victorious, but the sight of Andrew's pain tempered her satisfaction. This wasn't just a battle over money anymore, it was a reckoning for everyone involved. As she stepped out into the blinding flash of cameras, Jenny realized something she hadn't expected. For all her planning and maneuvering, the truth had cost more than she'd anticipated. And the fallout was only just beginning. The courtroom was quieter than usual, the heavy tension hanging in the air as everyone awaited the final arguments. It had been 2 weeks since the revelation of Margaret's interference in Andrew's past relationship, and the fallout had rippled through the case, leaving both sides shaken. Andrew sat alone at the defendant's table. Margaret, uncharacteristically, was absent, claiming illness. In truth, she had retreated to her Beverly Hills estate, knowing that her presence might further agitate her son. Andrew's face was unreadable, but the dark circles under his eyes hinted at sleepless nights and inner turmoil. He had not spoken to his mother since the revelation and barely exchanged words with Jenny except in court. Jenny, on the other hand, seemed oddly subdued. Dressed in a simple black dress, her usual air of confidence was replaced with something softer, almost vulnerable. She avoided looking at Andrew, her fingers twisting a tissue nervously. For the first time, she appeared less like a socialite and more like a woman caught in the storm of her own choices. The judge entered, and everyone rose. Once seated, she addressed the room. Before we proceed with final arguments, I will allow brief statements from both parties. Andrew's attorney rose first. Your Honor, my client wishes to make his statement directly. The judge nodded. Mr. Voss, you may speak. Andrew stood, his tall frame exuding quiet authority. He took a deep breath before addressing the court. This case has been about more than just money. It's been about trust, trust that has been broken on all sides. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the room before settling on Jenny. Jenny, I won't pretend that our marriage has been perfect. I know I've made mistakes, and I've hurt you in ways I didn't fully realize until now. But I also believe that you came into this marriage with expectations that were impossible for me to meet. Jenny looked down, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Andrew continued, his voice steady but laced with emotion. I've learned that wealth can be both a blessing and a curse. It attracts people for the wrong reasons, and it can make genuine connections feel almost impossible. But that doesn't excuse what's happened here. He paused, his jaw tightening. To my mother, if she were here, I would say this: I love you, but you crossed a line I can't ignore. You took something from me, something I may never get back, and you did it in the name of protection. But protection doesn't mean control. It doesn't mean deciding what's best for someone else without their consent. The courtroom was silent as Andrew sat back down, his expression a mix of exhaustion and relief. The judge turned to Jenny. Mrs. Carter-Voss, do you wish to make a statement? Jenny hesitated, then stood, clutching the tissue in her hand. She glanced at Andrew, her voice trembling as she began. I came into this marriage for the wrong reasons. At first, it was about the lifestyle, the wealth, the status. But somewhere along the way, I fell for the man behind the fame. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. I was wrong to pursue this case the way I did. I was angry, hurt, and desperate to hold on to something I thought I deserved. But what I really wanted was to feel like I mattered. She looked directly at Andrew, her eyes filled with regret. I know I've hurt you, and for that, I'm sorry. I can't change the past, but I want you to know that, despite everything, I truly did love you. Andrew's expression softened, and for a moment, the tension between them seemed to dissipate. The judge nodded solemnly. Thank you, Mrs. Carter-Voss. When the court adjourned for the day, Andrew lingered in the empty courtroom, staring at the now vacant chairs. Jenny approached him hesitantly, her footsteps echoing in the quiet space. I meant what I said, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. Andrew looked at her, his eyes searching hers. I know, he replied simply. And I'm sorry too. They stood in silence for a moment before Jenny turned to leave. As she reached the door, Andrew called out, Take care of yourself, Jenny. She paused, offering him a small, bittersweet smile. You too, Andrew. That night, Andrew drove to Margaret's estate. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of a single lamp in the study. He found her there, sitting in a chair by the window, a glass of wine in her hand. I didn't expect you, she said softly, her voice tired. Andrew crossed the room, standing in front of her. We need to talk. Margaret set the glass down, meeting his gaze. I only ever wanted what was best for you. I know, Andrew replied, his voice firm. But what you thought was best cost me something I'll never get back. And it nearly cost me my marriage. Margaret's eyes glistened, but she said nothing. I need to do things differently from now on, Andrew continued. I need to take back control of my life, and that means we need boundaries. Margaret nodded slowly. I understand. Andrew turned to leave, but before he did, he paused. I love you, Mom. But love isn't control. Remember that. As he walked out, Margaret sat alone, her reflection visible in the window. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of doubt in her actions. A crisp October breeze swept through the gardens of the Voss family villa in Beverly Hills. Andrew stood on the patio, gazing out at the manicured hedges and glistening fountain. It had been a week since the final court session, and though the dust had settled, the wounds of the battle still felt fresh. The judge's ruling had been as fair as it was final. Jenny had walked away with a modest settlement, enough to start fresh but far from the fortune she had initially hoped for. The Voss family trust remained untouched, Margaret's ironclad planning surviving the legal storm. Yet, despite what might appear as a victory, it felt hollow. The revelations from the courtroom had exposed fractures that no amount of legal protection could repair. Andrew had not heard from Jenny since their quiet exchange after the final session, though her words lingered in his mind. She had apologized, not just with words, but with the rare vulnerability she had shown in those last moments. For all her mistakes, Jenny had forced Andrew to confront truths about himself, his guardedness, his mistrust, and his tendency to let others dictate the course of his life. He was still working through those realizations, the sting of regret mingling with the hope of a clean slate. Miles away, Jenny was beginning her own journey of healing. She had moved into a modest apartment in downtown Los Angeles, far removed from the life of luxury she had once known. For the first time in years, she was entirely alone, the silence of her new reality both liberating and terrifying. The apartment was sparse, but Jenny found solace in its simplicity. On her kitchen counter sat a framed photo of her and Andrew, taken during the early days of their relationship. They were smiling, carefree, and oblivious to the chaos that would eventually engulf them. Jenny traced her fingers over the glass, her thoughts a mix of regret and determination. "This isn't the end," she whispered to herself, her voice steady. "It's just a new chapter." Back at the villa, Andrew found himself face to face with Margaret for the first time since the courtroom revelations. She approached him hesitantly, her usual air of authority softened by the events of the past weeks. For the first time in as long as Andrew could remember, Margaret seemed vulnerable, her sharp edges dulled by the weight of her actions. "Andrew," she began, her voice quieter than usual, "I know I've said this before, but I want you to know how sorry I am." Andrew turned to face her, his expression calm but resolute. "I know, Mom. And I believe you. But we can't keep living in the past, neither of us. I need to make my own decisions now, and you need to let me." Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'll try," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "That's all I can promise." Andrew offered her a small, genuine smile. "That's a start." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Andrew walked back inside, the warm light of the villa illuminating his path. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face it on his own terms. There was a sense of peace, fragile yet promising, that came with the thought of rebuilding, not just his life, but the way he chose to live it. But the story, however, was far from over. Margaret sat alone in her study that evening, her gaze fixed on the skyline as doubt crept into her mind. Andrew had forgiven her, but the cracks in their relationship were undeniable. And deep in her heart, Margaret knew that secrets rarely stayed buried forever. Somewhere out there, the choices she had made in the name of love and protection were waiting to resurface. Meanwhile, Jenny, determined to carve a path for herself, found the strength to move forward. But the question remained, could she truly leave the past behind, or would her mistakes follow her into her new life? Trust, forgiveness, and self-discovery had shaped their journeys, but life had a way of testing even the strongest resolves. Margaret's past actions hinted at more than just the story of Sophia King. What else had she kept hidden, and who might come forward to reveal it? Could Jenny find redemption, or would her ambition pull her into another storm? This chapter may have ended, but their lives are far from finished. The truth, after all, has a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it's buried. This story is a reminder that trust and honesty are the foundations of any relationship, but they are fragile and must be protected. Andrew learned the cost of letting others control his choices, while Jenny discovered that true self-worth cannot come from material wealth. Their paths may diverge, but the lessons they've learned will shape who they become. What secrets could still be hidden in the Voss family? What lies ahead for Jenny's future, now that she must rebuild her life? These unanswered questions are just the beginning. For more stories filled with twists, lessons, and unforgettable characters, make sure to subscribe to Epic Emotion Stories. Leave a comment to share your thoughts and let us know, what would you do if you uncovered a betrayal like Andrew's? Don't miss the next gripping tale where trust, power, and redemption collide. The journey is far from over.